Somewhere out there, in the dark, a man already knew where she was buried, long before anyone even knew she was gone. A quiet house, a warm room, a child who had just made it home safely. And within the span of a single hour, that safety was gone, without a sound, without a struggle, without a trace. What makes this case so unsettling isn't just the disappearance of Jonelle Matthews. It's the fact that the truth was hiding in plain sight for decades, spoken out loud by the very person responsible. Before we go any further, a quick warning. This story involves the disappearance and murder of a child, and some details may be disturbing for certain viewers. This is Crime Chronicles. If you're new here, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Every case we cover is built from real evidence, real timelines, and real people. Stories that don't just ask what happened, but how it was allowed to happen for so long. Because this one didn't stay buried by accident. For years, there was a man who spoke about the case as if he had been there. Not like a witness, not like someone speculating, but like someone who already knew how it ended. He wrote about it, he talked about it, he inserted details into conversations that no one had asked for. And somehow, those details kept getting closer to the truth, long before the truth was ever publicly known. At the time, no one could fully explain it. It sounded strange, maybe even obsessive, but not enough to accuse him of anything, not yet. Because the case itself had no answers, no suspect, no body, just a missing girl in a timeline that didn't make sense. What makes this story different is not just what happened in one night, it's what followed in the years after. The way silence stretched into decades, the way one person kept circling back to a crime that was never solved, and how, piece by piece, that pattern began to look less like coincidence and more like something else entirely. Before we go any further, a quick note. This case involves the disappearance and murder of a child. While nothing will be described in a graphic way, some aspects may still be unsettling. This is Crime Chronicles. Here, cases are examined through evidence, timelines, and verified accounts, focusing on how investigations unfold rather than speculation. If you're new, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. It helps build a clearer picture of who's following these cases and where these stories are being heard. Because this one stayed unresolved for a long time, longer than anyone expected, and when the truth finally came out, it didn't come from new technology or a sudden confession. It came from something that had been there all along. To understand how this went unsolved for decades, we have to go back to one night in 1984. December 20th, 1984. 5 days before Christmas. In the city of Greeley, Colorado, the night began like any other during the holiday season. Families were attending events, finishing last-minute preparations, and settling into routines that felt familiar and safe. That evening, 12-year-old Jonelle Matthews had something important to attend. She had been selected to perform with her school's honor choir, an event that mattered to her. Despite not feeling completely well in the days leading up to it, she insisted on going. It wasn't just about the performance, it was about being there, being part of something, and seeing friends before the holiday break. The concert went as planned. It was organized, well-attended, and even recorded for local broadcast. Jonelle performed alongside her classmates, including her friend Deanna Ross. After the event ended, there was no sign that anything unusual was about to happen. Everything about the evening remained routine. Deanna's father, Russell Ross, offered to drive Jonelle home. It was a short trip, nothing out of the ordinary. They arrived at the Matthews residence at approximately 8:15 p.m. Jonelle stepped out of the car, said goodbye, and walked toward the house. Russell and Deanna waited. This was a common habit. They stayed until they saw her safely enter. Moments later, a light inside the house turned on. That was enough. It confirmed she was inside, safe. The car pulled away. Inside the house, Jonelle was alone. Her father was out attending a basketball game for her older sister, and her mother was out of state. For a brief period, the house was quiet, but nothing about that situation was considered unusual. At around 8:30 p.m., Jonelle answered a phone call. It was a teacher calling for her father, leaving a message about the next school day. Jonelle took the message. The conversation was brief, normal, and uneventful. There was no indication of distress or interruption. That phone call is the last confirmed interaction anyone had with her. From that point forward, there is no verified activity. No additional calls, no confirmed sightings, no sounds reported by neighbors, nothing to indicate what happened next or how quickly it unfolded. The timeline narrows to a single hour. Somewhere between that phone call and the moment her father returned home, something changed, something entered that space, or someone did. And whatever happened inside that house left almost no immediate trace behind. After that call, there is no confirmed activity. At approximately 9:30 p.m., Jonelle's father, Jim Matthews, returned home. The expectation was simple: a quiet house. His daughter likely resting after a long evening. Nothing out of the ordinary. When he entered, the house appeared exactly as expected. The television was still on. The heater was running, keeping the space warm against the cold December night. There were no signs of disturbance, no broken furniture, no forced entry. Everything looked intact, but something was off. Near the living room area, Jonelle's shoes were placed neatly on the floor, not tossed aside, not scattered, positioned as if she had taken them off normally and intended to stay. That small detail mattered. It suggested she had settled in, even if only briefly. Jim moved through the house, calling out for her. There was no response. At first, it may not have seemed alarming. It was possible she had stepped out or gone to a nearby friend's house, but as minutes passed, that explanation began to lose weight. There were no indications that she had left on her own, no coat missing, no signs of preparation. The house told a different story. It suggested she had been there, and then suddenly wasn't. When law enforcement arrived, the focus shifted outside. In the fresh snow near the house, there were footprints. They were positioned close to a window, indicating that someone had been standing there, watching. Observing the inside of the home, the size and depth of the prints suggested they did not belong to a child, but the most unusual detail was what had been done to them. The footprints had been partially covered, not erased completely, but disturbed in a way that showed intent. A garden rake had been used to drag across the snow, breaking up the clear impressions and making them harder to analyze. It wasn't random, it was deliberate. That action introduced a critical element into the investigation: planning. Whoever had been outside that house had taken time not only to approach unnoticed, but also to attempt to remove evidence afterward. That suggested awareness, not panic, not impulse, awareness of what could be left behind. Inside, there were still no signs of forced entry. That raised another question. If someone had entered the house, how had they done it without leaving visible damage or triggering attention? The absence of noise was just as important as the presence of evidence. No neighbors reported hearing anything unusual, no disturbances, no signs of struggle. Taken together, the scene presented a difficult picture: a child inside a home, a brief window of time, evidence of someone watching from outside, and a disappearance that occurred without disruption. Whoever was outside that house didn't want to be identified. In the hours following Jonelle's disappearance, investigators moved quickly to establish what had happened inside the house and in the surrounding area. The initial priority was to determine whether this was a voluntary absence or something more serious. Given her age and the lack of immediate evidence pointing to violence, one of the first theories considered was that she may have run away. That possibility was examined early, but it did not hold up under scrutiny. There were no signs of preparation. Her personal belongings were still in place. There was no note, no indication of distress leading up to that night, and no reason to suggest she intended to leave. The timing also raised concerns. The disappearance occurred just days before Christmas, a period typically associated with family routines and planned activities. Investigators found nothing in her background or behavior that supported the idea of a voluntary departure. Attention then shifted to the family. This is a standard procedure in missing person cases, particularly involving children. Jim Matthews, who had reported her missing, was interviewed extensively. His timeline was verified through witnesses at the basketball game he attended. His movements were accounted for, and there were no inconsistencies that placed him at the scene during the critical window of time. After multiple interviews and cooperation with authorities, he was cleared as a suspect. Investigators also looked into Jonelle's biological mother, Terry Ver Martinez. Although she had not been part of Jonelle's life for years, her identity and background were still considered relevant. Surveillance and background checks were conducted. There was no evidence connecting her to the disappearance, and she was ruled out. As the case expanded, federal agencies became involved. The FBI assisted in reviewing evidence, coordinating leads, and providing additional resources. Their involvement added structure to the investigation, but it did not immediately produce results. Polygraph examinations were used as part of the process, though investigators understood their limitations. Results can be influenced by stress, emotional state, and the circumstances surrounding the test. While they were used to guide questioning, they were not treated as definitive proof of guilt or innocence. Despite the growing scale of the investigation, no clear suspect emerged. Leads were followed, tips were evaluated, and each possibility was tested against the available evidence. But none of them aligned in a way that explained what had happened. Every logical lead was explored, and none of them led to Jonelle. As the investigation continued without resolution, Jonelle's disappearance began to draw attention beyond the local community. What started as a regional case gradually became part of a larger national conversation about missing children. Her story was shared through media coverage, printed materials, and coordinated efforts aimed at generating leads. One of the most recognizable methods used during that time was the milk carton campaign. Her photograph and basic case details were printed on cartons distributed across multiple states. It was a strategy designed to keep missing children visible in everyday settings, reaching households that might not otherwise encounter the information. For many people, it became their first exposure to her case. The visibility extended further when the issue of missing children was addressed at a national level. During a public speech, President Ronald Reagan referenced cases like Jonelle's while discussing the broader concern of child disappearances in the United States. The mention placed her case within a wider context, highlighting the urgency and scale of the problem. Back in Greeley, community efforts remained consistent. Volunteers organized searches, distributed flyers, and maintained communication with investigators. Local organizations and churches participated in support initiatives, keeping attention focused on the case even as time passed. Despite the exposure and continued effort, the investigation did not produce new, actionable leads. Tips were received, but none could be verified in a way that advanced the case. Each potential sighting or report required follow-up, and each one eventually led to the same outcome. As weeks turned into months and months into years, the pace of the investigation slowed. Resources were reallocated, and active search efforts became less frequent. The case remained open, but without new evidence, progress stalled. The case didn't close, it just stopped moving. More than 3 decades after Jonelle disappeared, the case shifted in a way that no one had anticipated for years. In July 2019, workers conducting routine excavation in a rural area of Weld County uncovered human remains. The location was several miles from Jonelle's home in an area not previously associated with the investigation. Law enforcement secured the site and began a detailed examination. The remains were recovered carefully, along with clothing and other materials found nearby. At that stage, identification was not immediate. The remains had been exposed to environmental conditions for decades, which complicated the process. Forensic specialists relied on multiple methods to establish identity. Dental records were one of the primary tools used. Comparisons were made between the recovered remains and existing records associated with Jonelle. The alignment of those records provided a strong indication. DNA analysis was also conducted to confirm the findings. Despite the challenges posed by time, sufficient material was available to complete the identification process. The confirmation changed the status of the case. What had been treated as a missing person investigation was now officially a homicide. The discovery provided a physical location, a confirmed outcome, and a renewed direction for investigators. With the remains identified, attention returned to the original timeline and evidence. Investigators re-examined prior leads, statements, and individuals connected to the case. Advances in forensic science and data analysis allowed for a more detailed review of information that had been collected years earlier. The discovery also brought renewed public attention. The case, which had remained largely inactive for years, was now back in focus. New information was released, and investigators encouraged anyone with relevant knowledge to come forward. If you're following this case closely, Subscribe, because what comes next explains everything. The investigation was no longer searching for a missing person. It was now focused on identifying who was responsible and how they had managed to avoid detection for so long. The question was no longer where Jonelle was, but who had been hiding the truth all along. As investigators revisited the case after the 2019 discovery, attention began to focus on individuals who had been present in Greeley at the time of the disappearance. One name that resurfaced was Stephen Dana Panky. He had lived within a short distance of the Matthews home and attended the same church, Sunnyview Church of the Nazarene. At the time, he was in his early 30s, married, and known within the local community. On the surface, there was nothing immediately linking him to the disappearance. But as investigators reviewed historical records and statements, a pattern began to emerge. It was not based on physical evidence at first. It was based on behavior, timing, and a series of actions that stood out when viewed together. In the days immediately following Jonelle's disappearance, Panky made a sudden decision to leave town. According to later testimony, the trip was unplanned and carried out with urgency. He and his family departed early, traveling out of state during a time when the community was focused on searching for a missing child. The timing of that departure raised questions, particularly because it did not align with any known obligation or prior arrangement. When he returned, his attention appeared to shift toward the case itself. Reports indicated that he became focused on monitoring news coverage. This was not casual awareness. It involved actively seeking out information, listening for updates, and revisiting reports repeatedly. The level of interest went beyond what might be expected from a concerned community member. Over time, that interest developed into a pattern of involvement that drew further attention. Panky began contacting law enforcement, offering information related to the case. He presented himself as someone with knowledge that could assist the investigation. However, those offers were often tied to conditions. He requested immunity in exchange for details, suggesting that what he knew could have legal implications. This approach placed investigators in a complex position. On one hand, any potential lead had to be considered. On the other, the nature of his requests introduced doubt about his intentions. If he had relevant information, the question became how he had obtained it. If he did not, then his repeated contact required explanation. As the years passed, the pattern did not stop. References to the case appeared in various contexts connected to him. Documents, communications, and statements included mentions of Jonelle's disappearance, even when the subject matter was unrelated. The consistency of those references suggested that the case remained a central focus for him over an extended period. When viewed individually, each of these actions could be explained in different ways. A sudden trip, an interest in news, contact with authorities. But taken together, they formed a pattern that stood out during the renewed investigation. This wasn't someone avoiding the case. This was someone orbiting it. As the investigation intensified following the identification of Jonelle's remains, detectives began assembling a case built on the totality of available information. Without direct physical evidence linking a suspect to the crime, the focus shifted towards statements, behavior, and knowledge that could not be easily explained. One of the most significant elements involved a detail that had never been released to the public. Early in the investigation, authorities had identified footprints outside the Matthews home that had been deliberately disturbed using a garden rake. This information was withheld as holdback evidence, known only to investigators and the individual responsible. During interviews and documented statements over the years, Stephen Panky made references that aligned with that specific detail. The knowledge of the raked footprints became a focal point. Investigators needed to determine how he could have known about it without being present or directly involved. Witness testimony added further context. Angela Hicks, Panky's former wife, provided information about his behavior around the time of the disappearance. Her account included the sudden trip out of state, his interest in news coverage, and actions that appeared unusual in hindsight. Her testimony helped establish a timeline and offered insight into his conduct during a critical period. Another witness, Patrick Callis, came forward with statements made while he and Panky were housed in the same correctional facility. According to Callis, conversations took place in which Panky acknowledged involvement in a manner that suggested personal knowledge of the crime. These statements were evaluated alongside other evidence to determine their reliability and consistency. The case moved to trial in 2021. Prosecutors presented a narrative based on accumulated behavior, documented statements, and witness testimony. The defense challenged the absence of physical evidence, emphasizing the lack of DNA or direct forensic linkage. After deliberation, the jury was unable to reach a unanimous decision on the most serious charges, resulting in a mistrial. A second trial was held in 2022. The prosecution refined its approach, reinforcing the same core argument while incorporating additional testimony. The structure of the case remained consistent. It relied on the alignment of multiple elements rather than a single piece of conclusive evidence. The jury was asked to consider whether the combination of knowledge, behavior, and statements could establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. After reviewing the evidence, they returned a verdict that differed from the first trial. In the absence of physical evidence, his own words became the strongest proof. In 2022, the jury reached a decision. Stephen Panky was found guilty of felony murder and second-degree kidnapping. The verdict concluded a case that had remained unresolved for decades. He was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after a set period, according to the court's ruling. For the Matthews family, the outcome brought a form of resolution, though not closure in the traditional sense. Jim Matthews addressed the court with a measured tone, reflecting on the years that had passed and the impact of unanswered questions. Gloria Matthews expressed a different perspective, emphasizing the lasting effect of the loss and the difficulty of reconciling it. Jennifer Matthews spoke about the absence of her sister across major life moments, highlighting the personal cost of the case over time. The conviction was not based on forensic breakthroughs or newly discovered physical evidence. It was built through a pattern that developed over years of documented behavior and statements that aligned in a way the jury found compelling. This case wasn't solved by new technology. It was solved by time, persistence, and a pattern that couldn't be ignored. Do you think the jury got it right without DNA? Would he have ever been caught if he stayed silent?